Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Wassalatu wassalamu ala ashrafil anbiya'i wal mursaleen. Nabiyyina Muhammad bin Abdullah, salawatullahi alayhi wa ala alihi tahirin wa ala man qama bid-da'wati tawheed ila yawmiddin wa ba'd. Right, you don't have to worry about this. Okay, so that's the opening dua or supplication or prayer. We always begin in the name of God. I would like to thank you for inviting me once again. This is not the first time I've been invited, and every time I attend these events and I get to meet people, I'm always learning and I'm always developing my own knowledge. So I always come not to teach you anything, but to learn a lot from you for free, because I don't have to pay fees for it. So there's a lot we learn through these encounters. Many of you are familiar with Professor Amina Wadud and her work. She said something to me a few years ago, and she said that we learn more from engaging with real flesh and blood people and their lived experiences and our own lived experiences than we do from reading scriptures or religious texts. And I think this is a very important teaching. It is a teaching that goes back centuries, right from the beginning of the development of Islamic scholarship, that the lived experiences of people are important. They inform our reading of scriptures, and they should inform how we develop our ideas on law, theology, interpretation, and so forth and so on. A good interpretation of religious texts and scriptures is one that is informed by people's lived realities and experiences. This is why we find today that the greatest and most important contribution to what you might call the theological, legal, or philosophical contribution to Islam has come from Islamic feminists who introduced for the first time gender as a category of analysis. So what do we mean by this? Although women had played a significant role in the development of knowledge in early Islam, at some point in history, they were written out of that history. Their contribution was erased due to various reasons and factors we can discuss maybe during the question and answer session. Texts were written by men, mostly by men, even on subjects relating to women. These texts were being written by men and informing their students and their readers what they think women's experiences were and how to respond to the challenges faced by women. So we had a body of literature that was passed on from generation to another, and students today study these texts. I have studied them myself, and they are written through the voices of men, and they are not very accurate. They are not even in any way any representations of the experiences of women. So we have that body of literature. We also have literature that does not in any way record the lived experiences of people who were living on the margins of the Muslim empires. Often we focus a lot on the grand narratives, the big stories, the big texts that we think were the texts that were seminal, and ignoring the texts on the margins. Often we also assume that these big texts, the texts which became canonical, were always like that. We don't stop to consider that maybe they became famous not because they were the ideas were correct ideas or true ideas, but because they had power on their side. They had the power of the ruling caliph who patronized these scholars and enabled them to produce more works and institutionalized their works throughout the empire. And in these processes, you had women being, of course, written out, even though they had their own majalis, gatherings or classes, but they were let down mostly by their students. Because very often students would deliberately omit the female names of their teachers, wanting to be seen as people who had only studied under the famous and celebrity preachers of the day. So those who were not deemed to be celebrity preachers, mostly women, because they were not given the platforms, they eventually were written out of history. And most of the works we have inherited from the past, most of them were originally written as class notes, prepared as notes for presentation in gatherings like this. And then the students would then go on and compile these works and attribute them to their teacher. And in many of the authors we see on the covers of the book did not write the works themselves. They merely prepared the notes, and there were cases in which the scholar would edit the notes prepared by the student. So in situations where patriarchy, really the mechanism of exclusion and inclusion and exclusion were on the basis of gender, it meant that some women, even those who had students, found that the students didn't record those works, or if they recorded them, they put their own names on the cover, and we inherited those works, and assuming them to have been written by men when some of them had been written by women. So this was a common trend. So this is why it's important. The work that Islamic feminists in recent years have done is extremely important. But these are not new movements. They are as old as Islam itself. Right from the beginning of Islam, we had women like Khawla bint Tha'laba who challenged, in the time of the Prophet, who challenged the patriarchal laws relating to divorce. And if you read in the Quran, there's a chapter which begins, قَدْ سَمِعَ اللَّهُ قَوْلَ الَّتِي تُجَادِلُكَ فِي زَوْجِهَا وَتَشْتَكِي إِلَى اللَّهِ. God has heard the voice of the woman who complained to you or who challenged you relating to these particular laws and then complained to God. And this verse, you read the commentaries, they give detailed information from Khawla herself explaining what had happened. She was a victim of domestic violence. She was married to one companion or Sahaba who was very violent, and she had been subjected to a lot of violence at home. And one day he decided he was just going to divorce her using the pre-Islamic divorce laws. At that time, new laws of divorce had not yet been introduced in Islam, and she came to the Prophet complaining. She felt that this was a great injustice, but because new laws had not yet been revealed, there was nothing the Prophet could do, and he told her, I can't go against the establishment. I'm a new prophet. They are not going to listen to me if I tell them these laws are unjust. And she was not pleased with that, and there was an exchange. And then she turned to God, according to the accounts you read in the commentaries, and it was then that the verse was revealed. What is also interesting for me in that particular verse is how she is described as a woman who did what is called jidal. Jidal is not a kind of dialogue or conversation. It is a confrontation when you confront injustice. The Arabic term used is jidal, which literally means to confront someone, to confront injustice. She didn't do it politely. She didn't exercise sabr, patience, and she did everything not in accordance with what we are told that we should do when we challenge injustice. And yet, the revelation that came according to Muslim belief didn't condemn her in the way that she challenged injustice. In fact, she was praised for that. She became known as the Mujadila, that woman, the confrontational woman who challenged and confronted injustice. So the work that we see Islamic feminists doing today is really in a long line of tradition in Islam, which started with people like Khawla and also Fatima, the daughter of the Prophet, many examples from Aisha, and many others. I mention these because they are the most famous, but there are many others, often not written about, but who also contributed a lot. And this is why the view that we can't judge the past by the standards of the present is a flawed way of looking at the past, because it assumes that there were no voices of protest from the past. And it positions the dominant voices, those of the oppressor, as the only voice that existed in the past, as the only voice that is worthy of listening to. So when I hear someone saying we can't judge the past by the standards of the present, I already know the person is on the side of the oppressor, because you're assuming that those voices didn't exist. The voices of protest against injustice, they have always existed. So voices of protest against injustice have always existed. They are as old as human history. We find it not just in the Muslim history, in other histories as well, and this applies to every topic under the sun: gender, race, slavery, and everything. There has never been a time in which these things were morally acceptable. So they have always been condemned. There were people on the margins condemning them. It's because we choose not to read those voices on the margins. And that's why it's important when you're reading the past, always start from the margins. Read those texts that are often neglected, the texts that people don't want to read. Read them. You learn more from what the main texts don't say than really by just looking at the grand stories. So yes, the stories are important. And I have also been advised or asked that I talk about, I focus on rather personal experiences, personal stories, my own. And this is difficult. My introverted self is not very good at this sort of thing. But I'll try my best to share those experiences, drawing on my own life and experience, on how we think about issues such as justice, injustice, and resistance to justice, to injustice, resistance. Why is this important? I think it is important because people's lived experiences matter. They are important. They inform how we read scriptures. They inform how we read texts. And they also inform how we choose to engage in justice movements or just to sit on the side as spectators. So as I said, people's lived experiences and encounters with flesh and blood human beings are important and should inform how we interpret text. And they have informed my own engagement with the text. I was born in a Muslim family, brought up in a Muslim family. My father was Muslim, his father was Muslim, their father, going back generations, they were all Muslims. People often ask me, what about your name? They say it's not a Muslim name. There is no such a thing as a Muslim name. There's no such a thing as a Muslim name. You have Arabic names, you have English names. There's no such a thing as a Muslim name. Any name is a Muslim name. Anyway, the name was given to me. My father gave me the name in honor of his friend who was called, Mikael or Michael, depending on you can choose any pronunciation you like, I don't mind. And this is a very African thing to do, that when your favorite football team win a match, you can name your child after the name of the football team, or you can name your child after your best friend or someone who has done something in your life. So in the case of my father, it was his best friend, was an Englishman called Michael, and I was given that name. And It was important to my father, so it was important to me too. It is a Muslim name because it's in the Quran as well. And if you don't like it, then I'll pass fatwa on you. Why? because in the Quran it says, Man kana aduwa lillahi wa Jibril wa Mikala. Whoever is the enemy to God and Gabriel and Michael, be careful, right? So the Quran says that, you know. So if you don't like the name, then something wrong with you. We pass fatwa. So, so that was the kind of environment. Of course, although I lived in a Muslim family, we were surrounded by Christians. So I was familiar with the Christian traditions. And I was familiar with the lived experiences of Christians. They were neighbors, they were friends, some were even distant relatives. But I didn't know anything about members of the Jewish communities. So my knowledge of the members of the Jewish communities was informed by my reading of scriptures. I'll come to that. But because I lived with Christians, neighbors, although we were probably the only Muslim family, and then another one was maybe, distant away. Well, not many of us in that area, but we're surrounded by Christians. And in a country, in a region, in the Southern Africa, during colonialism and apartheid, during the time of resistance against oppression. So our allies and our friends were Christians in that struggle because we're surrounded by Christians, not Muslims, because the apartheid system divided people on the basis of their race, regardless of, faith didn't feature into it. So you had Muslims who were, if they were of Indian origin, they were placed in areas allocated for mostly Indians, so you'd have a high concentration of Muslims in those areas. And those who were black or white were placed in their own areas, so you'd find white Muslims would be probably to be the only family there, black Muslims similarly. So when you had the Imam reading the verse in the Quran, for example, Quran 3 verse 28, let not believers take disbelievers as allies other than the believers. It didn't apply to you. Although it was there in black and white in the text, your lived experience, your lived reality challenged that particular text. Because there was no way you were going to say, well, I'll only rely on Muslims when they are miles away. You are not even allowed to meet them. The people who come and wake you up at night to tell you that the police are coming to round people up are your Christian neighbors. So they were your allies in the trenches. They were your friends. So your reading of the scriptures on issues relating to the religious other were informed by your lived realities. So you didn't buy into the idea that the Christian is going to hell because you know that the Christian has been there for you when no one else was there for you. When there was a huge debate in South Africa whether Nelson Mandela was going to hell or to paradise. That was a debate. There's a book written by a good scholar and friend, someone I admire, Farid Ishaq, wrote a book called On Being Muslim. I strongly recommend that. There's a chapter on this discussion. This is the kind of discussion. So it was a theological, some people thought it was important to question whether Mandela would go to heaven or not. But for many Muslims who had lived under apartheid, who had experienced it, that was not even a question to have. They took it for granted that yes, he was going to heaven. And that there were many Muslims who collaborated with the apartheid system. Although the Quran, in almost every chapter, justice is an important part of the Quran. It's one of the attributes of God. Islam is the religion of justice. We preach this from the mimbar. And yet in reality, there were people who were giving. I sat in one of the sermons in a place called Azadville in Johannesburg, where I heard an imam preaching on the merits of the apartheid system. Right. So there were people who felt that the apartheid system was good for Muslims. They meant Indian Muslims because then they could live in their own communities, they could build their own schools, they could develop their businesses, and they were not affected at all by the laws in the same way that the black communities were, and the so-called colors, that's a South African term for mixed race, were affected by the apartheid system. So for the Muslim who lived in the so-called township, the black township, the ally was not the believer in this particular verse. It was the Christian neighbor, the Marxist neighbor, the socialist neighbor, and it was the gay neighbor. It was all these were the allies in the struggle for justice. And they turned up. So their reading, therefore, was informed by these lived realities. So this is why encounters are important and why real encounters with people should inform how we read text and how we develop our theologies. It's lazy theology if it is just based on text. It doesn't take into account people's lived realities. That's a lazy way of doing theology. It is bad theology. Then I did say that I had not met any Jews at all. So my understanding of the Jewish experiences or Jewish history or faith was based on my reading of the Quran and Islamic texts written by Muslims. And that is the experience of many Muslims, even in this room, if they have not met any member of the Jewish community. So you'd have had and read a lot of things, when you're growing up. And it was only after actual encounters when I went to university, there was a cafe, because this Jewish student community union was organized, so they had their own cafe because we were concerned about halal and haram. So we wanted to eat kosher, it was halal, you see. So we started going there to eat, the bagels, the salmons, and we started having conversations. It was only, and also through studies, some of our professors, that we discovered that most of what we had studied and most of what we thought we knew about Jews and their experiences and their history was not an accurate representation of their lived experiences of their faith, traditions, and their histories. And so when we read some of even the texts, we read Islamic texts, so we are always reminded of that, these are the writers' points of view. In other words, we learn more about the writers of the text than we learn about actual Jews and actual women, for example. So you learn a lot more about Suyuti than you learn about women. Suyuti wrote on women, right? You learn a lot more about Al-Jahid, who wrote on women, than you actually do about women, right? So if you want to read and understand the experiences of women, then you have to read about women. And so the body of literature we inherited, yes, when it comes to issues relating to interreligious dialogue, relating to gender, sexualities, race, it is problematic. You have to read it you adopt what we call a hermeneutic of suspicion. You have to look at these texts carefully, and you learn more about the time in which they were written, more about the authors than what they claim to be about. Right? Yes, racist readings of the Bible exist, racist readings of the Quran exist, and some Muslims may not realize that there is a huge body of literature written, especially in areas of anti-black racism. Racist interpretations of the Quran are there, racist interpretations of hadith are there. So, and some of these are recycled, often not in a way that you may see, but they inform how people engage with the racial other. I'm talking about Muslim communities. So some of the things we see in Muslim communities, the attitudes that others have, these attitudes have been informed by some of these readings. Racism operates at different levels. You have at more theological level, and then you have got at sort of grassroots level encounters between people. Some of it is just historical, social, whatever, but there is a degree of it which is also theological, which operates at that level, especially among scholars, that only people who read from the margins can identify and see these things. So people on the margins often see with a third eye. They see things that we often take for granted. They ask questions about things that we often take for granted. So women will ask questions that I, as a man, will take for granted, overlook. This has happened so many times in some of my readings of hadith. Then it was always either a woman would ask me, but what do you think this hadith means? You know, for example, the famous hadith that if a husband and wife, if the husband spend the night unpleased with the wife, then the angels are cursing the wife. And some woman asked, what about if it's the other way around? If it is the husband who's the trouble, so are the angels cursing him too? But the hadith doesn't say that. It only discusses the woman. So then, if you are an honest scholar, you ask these questions. You want to know why these texts say these things the way they say them. That becomes important. But these questions come about after real encounters with people. When you just read a text in a corner, it's an isolated existence. You are drawing on your own experiences. If you haven't had any encounter with people from different sexual backgrounds or of sexual orientations, so your reading will be based purely on the text. And that brings me to that other topic as well, which is an important topic. So there'll be pauses because we have an interpreter, so I have to be careful that when I speak, it's not fast, and and also it gives me a chance to check some of my notes, and and I can use that as an excuse. So this is a brilliant idea. Yeah. Right. So when I was growing up, like others, I had not had any real encounters with someone who was gay, for example. I may have had, but I didn't know. Not with anyone who openly say they were gay. That didn't happen until later through real encounter with people. So my own thinking on the subject, on the topic, was informed by my upbringing as an African Muslim, right? So, and that's how it wasn't a priority for me. You know, I wasn't thinking, you know, this person is gay. That's not an issue. And in Africa, it's quite common to see guys hugging and holding hands, a guy lying on someone's lap. It's part of the culture. So we don't have these kind of, as we're beginning to see in the West, that you interpret relationship between people. We were not brought up with that. So we didn't have that. I went to boarding school too, so we knew these things, you know. We had stories and, you know, but it was not based on what we thought someone looked, you know, the way someone looked like. So the actual, you know, encounters were really in life through meeting people in these kind of environments that I started learning more about the subject. And I started rereading some of the texts I had been reading on the topic. And as I said to you, yes, you know, even when you're in school, I mean, the school I went to, it was boys' boarding school, so we had things, we had stories, you know, but you know, those are just stories. You don't actually get to see someone who come and openly say, I'm gay, and things like that, right? So these encounters did inform how we started looking at some of the texts. And one of the challenges, I think, for Muslim theologians and scholars like myself is how to do good theology when it comes to this subject. And we often opt for the easy one, the lazy one of saying this is a choice, and that people are choosing to live this life. In other words, homosexuality is a choice. It's not a choice, right? You know, deciding to exist on samosas and McDonald's, that's a choice, right? So it's not a life choice. And And it's not a choice to be black, it's not a choice to be a woman, and it's also not a choice to be gay or to be LGBT. So that's how people are created and born. So the idea that it's a choice is something that we grew up with until, of course, we started learning more about the subject. And we were challenged to learn more about the subject through encounters. I wouldn't have bothered to look into this topic because, as I said, it wasn't a priority. Right? But then I started having young people come to me. This has happened a few times. One young man came to me and told me he was a Muslim and he had contemplated committing suicide because he was struggling with his sexuality. And he's gay and is a good Muslim, and he was convinced that he can't be gay and Muslim at the same time. And yet we know that sexuality is not an article of faith. It's not an article of iman. It has nothing to do with your iman, you're being a Muslim or not being a Muslim. And some people had told him that he could go to an imam somewhere in Bradford. They would pray for him and it would all come out. I asked him, I told him, I don't think that's possible because I am, heterosexual. You can't pray for me to be gay. You can do all the du'as. I will always remain the way I am. That's how I was created. So there's no reason why I should think that it's possible to create the gay out of someone, right? So the view that you can pray for people is really based on the assumption that heterosexuality is the norm. It is the only way that God created everyone. When we know that God created diversity and that those who are different are somehow choosing to live their lives like that. And there's no one who chooses to do something and then contemplate suicide. We know that's not how it works. So people, I think there was a survey done this year. There's a YouGov, I think, did a survey. They found out that 1 in 3 people in Britain believe that it's a choice. Although a majority of people believe that it's not a choice, 1 in 3 believe it's a choice. So, I think although the knowledge is developing, but for lazy theologians, it's quite easier to go to that choice because then it means you don't have to do a lot of theology. You see, the theology you have to do when you accept that people are created that way is much more challenging, but also important. Because you have to ask yourself, how would a just God create someone this way and then decide that this person is going to hell on the basis of how God created it? Right? So that's not a just God. So if you believe in a God of justice, then you have to ask yourself difficult questions about how that God engage with human beings, with creation. Right. So yes, the idea that these were lifestyles really were reinforced by textual readings, by literalist readings, because they reduced identities to acts, to what people do. When identities are about more, they're about emotional and psychological. They have an emotional and psychological component to them. They are not about the acts of what people do. No one defines heterosexual people in that way, through acts. They are looked at as holistic human beings with emotions of love and experiences, and they choose to express that love in many ways. And that really is the case with all human beings, that they have an emotional, psychological component to their identities, which cannot be reduced or limited to what they do, to their deeds and actions. Right. Although those deeds and actions may be important to them, but it is certainly not the totality of their being and their existence. Right. And so these are some of the questions that I have struggled with as someone who read the early text and who is also, in a way, a textualist, brought up as a textualist, but I'm not saying I'm a prisoner of the text. I've already told you that I was brought up in a context. I come from a tradition where the lived reality matter. It's a matter of life and death. Your reading of the text can be a matter of life and death. So I'm not prepared to make judgment on a person on the basis of what is written in ink. I'm not going to say someone should be killed simply on the basis of what I've seen written in ink. I am more interested in how I can relate and engage with people as human beings. And I think that is more important, and that kind of theology is more difficult to do because people want certainties, and often people find comfort, lazy people find comfort by sticking to the text or simply reading around the text. But if the text is to become existentially meaningful to you here and now, then it means you need to look at other and more ways of reading that particular text. And it is in this area that the work that Islamic feminists in particular have done is extremely important. It's important because it has forced all of us to look at these texts again. I'm not saying that this idea of reading and rereading the text is something new. It is part of the Islamic scholarly tradition, but the questions that are being asked today are the kind of questions that people in the past either did not bother to ask, or if they did ask, those questions were put in the margins, and you will often find them in the footnotes, not in the main text you are reading. So that is the greatest contribution. But it is also I'm not also suggesting that that has not been without controversy. In fact, the fierce opposition to these kinds of readings, particularly readings done by people on the margins, is precisely because these readings are important. It is because that the introduction of gender as a category of analysis is extremely important. It's because of that reason that we are finding that resistance is aggressive and as fierce as it is, especially on social media, where women who choose to take a stand, who choose to express themselves, are shut down in very violent ways. I remember in the 90s, one of our teachers was socially conservative, traditionalist. He said, this was within the context of, colonialism and apartheid, where you had a younger generation of theologians, our generation, and mostly women, who were beginning to ask questions and challenge the sort of traditionalist interpretations of the situation, where you're being told that you just have to respect the way things are, have passion, exercise sabr in an apartheid system and so forth. We are okay, we have our own schools, we shouldn't jeopardize that, we shouldn't do anything that will undermine our existence. So you know that when you go home on holidays or when you travel, you are restricted because of the racist and white supremacist laws. So you had to take a stand, and you wanted to take a stand as a Muslim because you're a Muslim. So you had, so there were so many examples to draw upon, from Muslim history. You had Hussein, who became a key figure for people, for our generation, and we wanted to identify with Hussein, not with Yazid, right? So and that meant that we took a different position from that of our teachers. But the discussion was always from the teacher's point was that, younger generation of scholars were being dismissed as modernists, which was a dirty word in that context, and all kinds of words and labels that they may have the media, they may have that, but we have the pulpit, the member from which to convey the message. And so, because women were not allowed into the mosque, forget about the member, they can't even come through the door. So it meant that they didn't have a platform from which to express and to speak. So you had now radio stations opening, and women were trying to get their presenters onto some of the radio stations. In one of the cases, including Radio Islam in South Africa, which went through the courts, the Constitutional Court, young women were challenging that they couldn't be excluded from the channel purely on the basis of their gender, you know. And the channel was arguing that, well, this is our religious belief, which is enshrined in the new South African Constitution. But then they also had theologians who were saying, no, there's no Muslim scholar who has said that the voice of a woman is aura, right? It doesn't exist anyway. So the radio lost the case. So they were forced to introduce women, but then they gave them the Samusa program to do. Right, so, but it was a first step. So the idea that the platform should be the control of the ulama is part of the reason why it has played a significant role in monopolizing knowledge and power. But social media has changed that. Social media has created a new member for people. They don't have to go through the door into the mosque to express themselves. They can say it on the minbar. Women can do that. And this is why you find the reaction, the backlash, if you want to call it that way, the violent reaction from Muslim men who see this as a threat, because now the social media has democratized knowledge, the production and dissemination of knowledge. You can write your blog, you can say what you want, and even though you're not allowed through the doors of some mosques, not all, some mosques, then at least you can do that from a social media platform. So part of the kind of misogynistic responses you get when people choose to speak are really a reaction against what they see as a threat to knowledge, or the production of knowledge and the monopolization of knowledge. But there is also a racial element to it, especially whenever I think of scholars like Amina Wadud, although she hasn't said anything that male scholars have not said in the past or even today, but somehow the reaction or response to her views is different, is much more violent. And that is because she's a black woman, right? And I remember a few years ago, there was an American writer, an American scholar, Muslim academic, I think, who almost plagiarized all the ideas of Amina Wadud and published an article online, and it was shared by everyone, people praising him for being forward-thinking and visionary and things like that. The same thing if it had been written, she has obviously already written on the subject. Many other Islamic feminists have written on the topic, but the response has been different. Right? So these are some of the things that happen when people choose to speak truth to power and when they decide to take a stand, especially if they are people who have historically been excluded from the conversation. But this shouldn't deter people from taking these positions. And I know that many people do so at great personal loss. Many people, the emotional and mental abuse that you experience when you speak out can be too much. But I hope that people will continue to do so, because really this is not the first time this has happened, and women have taken these positions before. There's a book compiled it's called Balaghatun Nisa, compiled in the early Abbasid period. It was compiled by a man, but in his introduction he said something, and he said that I'm compiling this particular text. He said, I noticed that most of the rhetoric, the balagha, rhetoric was an important field in the development of Islamic knowledge. Most of the works were produced by men, and I wanted to see if anything had been produced by women. And in my research, he writes, I found out that what women had produced was more and surpassed what men had produced. But he went to produce a small booklet. But that introduction is important. But if you understand what balagha is, balagha means the art of speaking in public. So we know that the fact that these texts exist clearly suggests that women were speaking. The examples he collects, he has examples from Aisha, from Fatima, and many others are included in the list of women and examples of their public speeches. And these were delivered in public and often to oppressive rulers, in front of oppressive rulers. In fact, most of them in that text were delivered to speeches where women stood up in front of oppressive rulers and challenged those rulers. And these were documented in these collections. So this has been going on, and I'm happy that I live in a time in which I can listen to some of these voices and learn a lot from them in the way that maybe some people in the past have not been able to learn. And I think I know that we have 1 hour only of presentation, and then we open up for discussion. So I will stop here, and then we can have whatever discussions you want.